Yeah, hello, Shelly. Very warm welcome. I'm super excited to have someone from space here, not because that's in the last couple of days and weeks became more prominent, but also we met already in Davos, and I really admire your work. So, very warm welcome from my side.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be with you. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to talking about space and continuing our discussion that we started back in Davos.
Yeah, I first maybe want to give the audience a little bit about who is Shelley, and I will obviously turn to you to describe yourself. But what I discovered, what most people maybe don't appreciate, where you grew up. You grew up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I didn't know where that was, but I checked it. You were an only child, and your mother actually worked the assembly line at a tire plant. And then from there, she took her way into management. So I believe, like my mother, also she was great role model for you, and how you were raised also somehow makes up how you grow up yourself and what you do in life. I know that you learned very early, and for women also to be in the space environment, you know how to earn your seat. And what I also admire, you have been with the US Air Force straight out of high school. So saw some images with the whole uniform. You have been there for over 29 years, but you always had a different reach. You always wanted to reach more. Maybe you can talk also about this. You left the military, you became CEO of the Space Foundation even. Tell us a little bit more of that. How did your journey come from where you come from a U.S. Air Force military role into Space Foundation and what you do today?
Well, thank you so much again, and you know a lot more. I'll make sure to send you that check for covering all those things. And of course, kudos to my mom for being an amazing mother and a role model for me. She made it clear that we can do anything we want. We just have to work hard for it. It won't come easy, but you need to apply yourself. You need to get education. You need to be disciplined, and you need to go after it. So, thank you to my mother for instilling those traits in me. As you said, my journey has a few zigs and zags, I call it. So, right out of high school, I did enlist in the US Air Force. I wanted to see the world, and the Air Force was a great way to do it. I also, like many people, did not have college money, and I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do had I gone to college right out of high school. So I enlisted in the Air Force. I was stationed in Turkey and Germany, in Colorado here in the U.S. While I was an enlisted airman, the Air Force had me as a personnel specialist. So I did like human resources, and I did that. But at night, I went to school at night and on the weekends and earned my college degree, and that allowed me to apply to become an officer in the Air Force, which kind of started that next phase of my journey. And when I became an officer, the Air Force made me a space acquisition officer, which even today I have people say, what does that mean? I was one of those people who purchased the space assets, so satellites and ground stations and
Unbelievable.
rockets. So that's what I did for the government. I worked with the U.S. Air Force. That's what I was in. There was no Space Force at this time, and we collaborated with NASA, a few of our allies, but primarily U.S. focused. And I did a multitude of jobs while I was in the Air Force. I was that program manager doing space procurement for rockets and ground stations and satellites. I also became a professor at Defense Acquisition University, so I could teach about project management and the space life cycle and how we procure space assets. And then I worked on Capitol Hill for my last 5 years in the Air Force, really understanding the importance of policy and budgeting and the role the government plays in creating opportunities. And as you said, after 29 years, I made the next pivot. I went to work in industry. So, Space Foundation, what is a nonprofit? So they do events, they do educational programs, and it was a great opportunity to step beyond the military. And Space Foundation opened up the aperture so I could see all the international opportunities for space. But at the time I transitioned out of the Air Force, I also saw the commercialization in space was really taking off. And this was about 10 years ago. So we're all very familiar with SpaceX and Blue Origin, but there are so many other space technologies we're using every day that most people don't even realize. So that's really that wave I saw from Space Foundation was that international and commercialization side. And then
Yeah,
2
I
years.
think
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, no, no, no. I sorry. Just continue, because you picked on this. A lot of people don't know what space means really for us on Earth, and I think for a lot of people it's also quite distant or science fiction, or it sounds great, but they don't know that satellite systems, for example, has rescued 63,000 people since 1982. And it would be very interesting, I believe, and you also have your work is a lot about this. What is it? What satellites really do for people like me on Earth?
Absolutely. And that's what I started 2 years ago. I launched my own company, SB Global, so I'm writing books, I'm out there speaking. So for any of your audience that's listening, I'll be in Bratislava next week for their various conferences they have, VTech, SAPIA, AmCham. I'll be speaking with the AmCham. We'll be talking about space and healthcare. So lots of opportunities if you're gonna be in Bratislava next week. I look forward to connecting with you. But that's what I'm doing now is really kinda highlighting how space is more than just astronauts and rockets. It's really the foundation, and it's an invisible infrastructure for our daily lives, for the economic environment we live in. So one easy example to use is right now, we're using telecommunications to do this broadcast. Well, all of telecommunications came initially from the Apollo era so that NASA could talk to astronauts. And then it went from a government technology, it became commercialized by entrepreneurs and investors. And now we think about Zoom and Google and Teams and all these applications, but we really don't know that we're using an application that initially was for the space industry.
Yeah, I what I also find very interesting, apart from communication, is the connect to healthcare you highlight so much, and as you said, you will talk about it also in your next journey. Can you give us a little bit more flavor of what space and space technology in particular means for healthcare? Because that's also something I'm totally fascinated by, and a lot of people don't know that.
Absolutely. So while I'm in Bratislava on the 24th of April, I'll be doing an event with the AmCham of Slovakia, and we're going to be talking about space and healthcare and the next steps in space and healthcare. So it's a huge area. And some of the things I want to share is people don't realize when we think about eye surgery, that initially the tracking of the eye came from the space technology because it was designed to track astronauts' eyes and see what they were doing. We also looked at all the looking at what astronauts go through as they leave Earth and go into microgravity environment and come back. What are the impacts on their bodies? So what we've learned is for women, we already suffer from osteoporosis here on Earth, bone density loss, but women who go to space suffer it even more because we're losing that pull of gravity on our bones and our muscles. And so we're losing that bone density even faster. So some companies have even come up with technology that was designed with that space application in mind to help um, not only reduce but repair that bone density loss. And I know people, it's now approved here in the US by the FDA to get a medical device to help women increase their bone density, whereas before it was really about moderating or stopping the bone density loss. So that's one thing. We just saw Artemis come back last week. You heard some astronauts, if you were listening to the various news channels, they were talking about how is it when those astronauts get out of that capsule, sometimes they don't initially walk right away. Well, because they're floating, their ears, they haven't received stimuli for, those 10 days. Walking, we get stimuli from our inner ear to keep our balance. So they could be a little wobbly when they first take those first steps back on Earth. Also, your fluids, because of gravity, they don't pool in your head, but when you go to space, especially for men, they can pool a lot in the head, and that's why you see some of the astronauts get a little puffy, but especially for men, what they've seen is that that fluid can impact the vision in the eyes, and so what we're seeing is we're looking at what's happening to astronauts, and now we're looking at it on Earth, and we're able to create some medical technologies to solve those. Some of the other technology many people don't know about, for our female audience listeners as well as men, is that technology is really evolved from the space industry. We looked at Hubble space technology that was designed to look for anomalies in space. and some amazing astronauts. I know like Jose Hernandez was part of it. Helped to create the technology for modern mammogram technology. So think about all the lives that have been saved, both men and women, because I do know men who are survivors of breast cancer that are saved because of that early detection. We also have some technology with angioplasty, robotics. Also, when astronauts go to space, they have miniaturized devices to monitor them. Well, that same technology has come back to Earth and is commercialized in human healthcare right now on Earth. So I won't dive too much more, but those are some of the technologies we're using. And now, what's so great is some of the technologies that are being advanced in space, like cancer research, heart disease, macular degeneration, which is a blindness that happens to older people where they lose their sight, and there's no cure right now. So there are a lot of diseases, even Parkinson's, that are being studied now in space because of that microgravity environment is so conducive to research.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and it's good to hear that it's not all about science fiction or all about rockets, but much more. And what I have been incredible impressed by is also Christina Koch's statements when she saw the Earth from the universe. She said, people ask her, "What did you feel?" And she just said, "I felt humility." So it's the broader concept also that we are on Earth, yes, but there's a wider universe, not only for data centers, which we know there's a big race now also for data centers to bring them into place. And the other quote she said, which I absolutely love, is, "We will always choose Earth. We will always choose each other." So this kind of, she talked about crew and not team, and that
Mhm.
spirit. I know that resonates with you because you talk a lot about your learnings in leadership, and how this connects with space. Space is such an extreme environment, and I believe I have not been an astronaut, but if you're in that kind of environment, you need to be together. If you don't work together and you are not behaving like a real crew, working with each other and doing it together, you're basically facing death. And I love to learn more from you. Also, how you think about leadership. You just said also in your experience, the HR part, you have the military part, which sounds very tough. You also have the space part, you have the technology. But what for you is technology and humanity in that sense?
Well, I think that's really great. And I love what you shared about humility as we think of space. You know, Frank White wrote about it called the overview effect, that many astronauts, when they go to space, what they see is how fragile the Earth is. Neil deGrasse Tyson once described it that if the Earth were an apple, our atmosphere would be as thin as the skin of the apple. So it really gives you an idea of how fragile we are. You know, we live on planet Earth. We don't really, how big our planet is, how amazing it is to travel and see different things. But when you go to space, you see that we're just a rock floating in space in orbit around a sun. And there's other rocks, and there's other rocks that could hit this rock, which have happened in the past. And so it really gives you a different perspective. And I agree. I think humility is really an important way to look at it, that of all the planets in our solar system, this is the best one to be on. And we really need to look at the humility of how we work together to make it the best place for all of us to live, as you said, crew, not just team.
Absolutely. We also obviously see that there is, and you mentioned some of the technology, but there is a huge um, jump. It's not only exponential. If you look at, we have seen that Jensen Hung had that in his latest keynote. He showed Clawbox versus Facebook, and Facebook goes like this, exponential. But now we talk about the so-called takeoff. So technology goes like this in terms of adoption. And on the other side, we have the regulation, which is also quite heavy in space, but in finance and healthcare. And we have a huge gap. So regulation and also how people get on board with all the technology is much slower. It's almost linear. And how do you see that we can close this gap of what I call governance, in which I've seen you also have been communicating, writing about, thinking about. So it would be very good to grasp your thoughts on this.
Well, I think that's wonderful. We really, I always like to say that the space mindset has three big components, and that's building markets, building talent, and building scale. And the area you're talking about is really the building scale. How do we work with industry, academia, government, international to create the partnerships, the shared technology and the integration of those technologies so that they work together to better all lives. And so I kind of share there's a lot of opportunities. So one of them is government can be the leader. Recently, NASA announced their new program for a permanent moon facility. And that's going to really unlock a lot of innovation, entrepreneurship, opportunities for investors, opportunities for people to develop companies, because NASA won't actually do the three phases of that plan ignition. It'll actually be done with contractors, with innovators, with entrepreneurs. So sharing that innovation creates the spin to create the technologies, because as we return to the moon in this time to stay, that's going to create a lot of technology that's going to better life here on Earth. So I want to make sure our audience knows that it's not just about going to the moon for the moon's sake. It's really about creating an ecosystem that also comes back and benefits humanity. So I think that's really
Yeah.
important, those partnerships. And then, so government can set the way with policies, but with space, it's a little bit more challenging because it is an international domain. So it's not just the US, it's all the international partners. So, the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs and many other international organizations where other countries have to discuss what does that look like. So there are opportunities in space, but there's also challenges in space, such as space junk. We have a lot of orbital debris, but there's laws and challenges with how we can create solutions to resolve those. So before we dive into any more of that, I'll take a pause right there because it can get a little technical. Hopefully, we have a few space lawyers listening.
Yeah, we for surely have, and it's obviously regulation is not what everyone is most excited about. On the other hand, if it's not there, people are getting very excited about. There is also what you mentioned, this partnerships and how we can get more access. So if we look at some of the data, you also have in some of your publications. You write about cyclones killed in Bangladesh in 1970, for example, where 500,000 people. In 2020, a comparable storm only killed 26. In Kenya, we had NASA satellite data took crop insurance from 30,000 farmers to 420,000 farmers. And these were not kind of pilot programs, but real results. So the big question I have, and I'm sure a lot of the audience have, we have these super partnerships, we have these possibilities with space to solve food problems, to solve also climate issues, to see storms coming before they hit. So why don't we have this everywhere? Why can't we stop this more?
So, an excellent question with many challenges to it. The first challenge is we cannot lay fiber optic cable everywhere around the world. So, there are still millions of people, a lot in the island nations around the equator or in remote parts and mountains where we cannot lay fiber optic cable. So, there are communities that are not connected to the global economy. That means they're not getting the data they need. So they're not getting, they don't have their phone with the latest weather app, seeing what's happening. So some countries may not know a cyclone is coming because they may not have accurate weather prediction coming from satellite data. So the technology exists, but how do we get it to the individual that really needs it, especially that may not have access to the technology? Another challenge is training. So a lot of this technology is in English. A lot of the space industry is in English. But when I go visit various countries around Africa, they might speak French uh, or other languages. So, I go to Togo a lot. They speak French. So you have to be able to take the technology and not just say, here's technology and walk away. It's about technology. How is it applied? You have to be able to provide the training. Why is important? How could it benefit your community for the farmers? Understanding the conditions of the weather, the climate. Cameroon a year ago had massive flooding that basically washed away the crops. Other parts, you talked about Kenya. A few years ago, they had a massive drought. So, really being able to provide this information so that farmers and governments can take action and put plans in place before a crisis happens is critical. But also, we look at there can be illegal fishing, human trafficking, wildlife trafficking. Well, Earth observation data, especially through partner organizations and nonprofits, can provide that data to governments so that they can increase security. Again, illegal fishing is taking place everywhere. We're seeing human trafficking happening, we're seeing wildlife trafficking happening and border incursions. And so a lot of space technology can provide that persistent overview effect and provide that data. As a matter of fact, satellites are passing all the time. The data is available. It's how is it getting to the people who can make the decisions in those countries. So it's about training and it's about making it available. And then how can those local communities use it for their benefits? Not necessarily how maybe the US uses it or China or Russia. We really need to take the technology and then work with that community to come up with ways that work with their activities. Because if there's no trust in the data or training how it works, then it doesn't matter. So this is less about a technology space issue. This is more about a human issue and how we work together. One of my favorite programs, my good friend Dr. Catherine Nakalibi, who's the NASA Harvest Africa director, she tries to help farmers in Africa understand how space technology can help them with their crop yields, understanding what the weather patterns are, how that might impact them, allowing them to make better decisions. So that's a great program because it's about working with local communities. And NASA Harvest is not just in Africa, it's around the world.
Absolutely. I also looked at some of the economics, and there seemed to be something wrong because you have every dollar invested in space returns 40, so huge economic benefit. You also have the space economy will hit 1.8 trillion by 2035. Africa, you mentioned a couple of times, budget spent is 426 million, and I think it was 2020. ESA alone is 8.7 billion, and there's a huge gap. So this gap to me doesn't seem acceptable. And you mentioned a few things, education, but there's also a place where is the money spent? How is the money spent? And where do we get the funding from to spend it wisely? If we look at AI and the huge amounts being spent, and now we think about AI in data centers in space, which I think it's great, but it's also a challenge.
Excellent. So I think we need to look at this differently, less about the dollars invested and more about, again, the usage. So the US, China, Russia, European Union have a different model. We have astronauts and rockets and launch facilities, and we have a legacy system, and that legacy system has to be maintained and upgraded. Cape Canaveral and Vandenberg Air Force Base have legacy systems that have to be upgraded. That's one of the things I worked on when I was in the Air Force. Whereas when you go to Africa, it's a different technology. They have the ability to leapfrog technology. They don't have to follow the same path the US is following to take advantage of space technology. They don't necessarily have to have their own satellites. They can contract satellites. They can also look at other ways of technology. So most people in Africa at least have a phone. They may not have a computer or other things. So it's really about how do they leapfrog the technology to apply it. And again, there's 54 countries in Africa. This is a continent. So this is every country has to look at how they can use this to best serve their people's needs. And it really has to start with your constituents. What do they need? And that's not just in Africa, South America and other areas of the world. What will help your people, your constituents, and how can space technology be part of the solution? Space technology should not be the starting conversation, it should be part of the solution conversation.
And what are your thoughts on when you look at this huge data center, which Elon Musk is saying he wants to build, and much more in, and obviously in space? And you have companies like Star Cloud. They collaborate with NVIDIA. Then you have Google. You have specialist companies. You know them better than me. So how do you think how realistic it is, why they do it, and should we think about it?
Excellent. So I think we can think about the evolution of low Earth orbit. And so that's where we're really talking about, the International Space Station, and then a little bit further out. But what we're thinking about is the government has kind of run the International Space Station. So the next evolution is really the commercialization piece of it beyond the International Space Station. So you talked about data centers. That's one option. Initially, everybody was excited about data centers on Earth. Now they're not excited about data centers on Earth. We even had a hearing in the community I live in here in Colorado about data centers in this community. Whereas you take them to space, obviously you're already in a cold environment. They're removed from the environmental issues here on Earth, so they're removed from that. But there's also other technology. So I know we talked about healthcare, but so many things can be done with healthcare applications that as we look to these commercial space stations and manufacturing in space, is that really the next evolution of the economy and the ecosystem with space is to create all these other benefits in space that really benefit humanity. So taking data centers off, I just saw a pitch on Monday from a space company that's looking at harnessing the sun's rays to beam them down to solar panels on Earth. So, not the ground infrastructure required, really just a space infrastructure required that could increase those solar panel usage and storage. So, there's a lot of solutions in that space economy that it's really for Earth economy. And so, I share with you that as we come up with these challenges, we need data centers. If we don't want to have them on Earth, they can easily be put in space. We want to have research labs on space. We have one research lab in space. Well, two, we can count the International Space Station. And if we want to count the Chinese space station, that's doing research. But we need a lot more. Healthcare activity needs a lot more space stations. We talked about the orbital debris. There's so many parts and pieces up there. So some companies are looking at, we used to launch satellites, and once they ran out of fuel, they were supersonic or burned up in the atmosphere. Some companies are saying, well, maybe we could refuel them now and we'll become gas stations in space. Others are saying maybe we can capture that debris, remanufacture it in space, and reuse it for something else. So a lot of entrepreneurs are coming up with great ideas for how that next evolution of space is. And we'll come back to that main thread. That doesn't mean that every entrepreneur in Africa has to be thinking along those same lines. There certainly are, but a lot of the entrepreneurs in Africa I talk to are looking at how they can create solutions that create marketplace for them, whether it's in their country in Africa, the regions that they live in, or even internationally. So I think that's the really important part is everything, although it sounds very planetary, it's very community based.
Yeah, and also again, we have you as an expert right here now. It sounds maybe at the beginning a bit easy. Oh, there's much cooler there, and we can just put them there. But there are already thousands of satellites, and there are things flying around. So we almost have to also control the traffic and how it works. And you mentioned the debris in orbit. So how do we make it more sustainable even? These are thoughts, a normal human being, when we are on Earth, we think like we have to first cover sustainability here, which is 100% true. But we are so connected to space that we have to think about the universe, and not only from a philosophical point of view, but from a very practical point of view that you just described. So when you think about the leaders we have, we also have in our audience a lot of, we educate a lot of people in master classes about the interconnection between what we just talked about, healthcare, finance, technology, AI, how everything is interconnected, and how you have to appreciate that. So even if I'm in finance or in healthcare, I have to know a little bit about these different pieces to bring them together and to see the impact. So what is in your view also the biggest impact for every leader, and every leader should think about and walk away and say, okay, these are the 5 big things I have to know, and I have to talk to Shelli or read your book. So what is it, what leaders really need to know?
Well, I think the big takeaway is that technology is not isolated. So we've talked about so many different technologies. Yes, there's space technology, the rockets and satellites, but we talked about technology on Earth, all the way down to individuals who can get information on their phones. So what we have to look at, and I say that with my thesis of the space mindset, it's really about the convergence of technologies.
Yeah.
We used to, a decade ago, technology was kind of isolated. AI might have been over here, and healthcare and space, and they were separate verticals. What I'm seeing now is these technologies are converging. So AI, healthcare, and space can all be working together. Robotics, space, and AI can be working together. Cybersecurity and so what we need to do is have more of a space mindset and look at how the technology is converging and look at things as systems and not silos. And how do we bring the right team together? So that was something, as you said, I did in the Air Force when I was a program manager for space projects. We had the finance person, the logistician, the engineer, the contracting officer, and then we would talk about what's happening with our program. Well, now as we look at technology, that's really something CEOs and boards need to be thinking about. Do they have a chief technology officer on their board? Are they looking at how the technologies are coming together? What are the benefits, but what are the risks? We're seeing already, we just saw a big, get together with the banking experts here in the US because of some AI potential threats and, vulnerabilities that were discovered. So what are those threats? And we need to be talking about that because as you said, we think about the technology spiral, we can think all the way back to, the steam engine, the automobile, but the technology curve is now compressing and technology is advancing very quickly. You already talked about policy having a hard time keeping up. It's even more difficult to keep up as we're seeing how quickly it's evolving because it's not just AI, it's social media, it's we're seeing it in cybersecurity, space activities. So these policies can no longer be looked at just in isolation, and CEOs and companies can no longer look at these technologies in isolation. So that's part of that space mindset, looking at things as a system holistically, and then starting to look at how do you address them.
And is there something specific when you also consult companies, or when you talk to CEOs, to boards? I'm also obviously a board member. And when you talk about space mindset, is it something which resonates? Or first they say, why space?
And I say it's not, the question isn't why space, it's why and how can space solve challenges on Earth? Because the goal is, and it already is, space is really an infrastructure. It's already running so many things, telecommunications, the finance system, agriculture. We're using satellites for precision agriculture. It's on the John Deere tractors and the Caterpillar. And people just don't even realize that it's already the infrastructure. But it's really about how can we create that infrastructure that allows companies to develop and grow. So you listed a number for space technology and the growing marketplace, but that doesn't take into account that are maybe using space as the infrastructure, like an Airbnb or an Uber. Those businesses are completely dependent on GPS and technology through space and cyber. So having space as the infrastructure continues to create new opportunities. But the next evolution is really, and I've seen some CEOs that are doing this now, is how do we connect those individuals that are not connected to the global economy because they're those remote island nations in the equator or mountainous regions. And the only way we can connect them is with satellite technology. Bring them into the global economy and give them an opportunity to not only have the data, but also to increase their GDP, their quality of life, and then eventually become consumers of those space technology. So initially it could be grants, and I'm seeing public-private partnerships to provide this technology initially for individuals in remote regions of the world. But eventually the business model is it does become a business because when you elevate people and you allow them to have a better quality of life, it then allows them to become customers as well as creators of new technology.
Yeah, you also, it just came up to my mind. You mentioned in Colorado, in your community, you talked about the data center. And I'm curious to hear what your discussions were because I read some articles in the US and I think it was in Pennsylvania where farmers, and there are also some videos where they were interviewed, just outright declined huge offers, 26 million offers. And one woman said, I'm born here. This is my land. My land gives me my life. There were all these cows, which we saw. And how do people approach this? Can you share this with us, what you discussed, and how do people think about it?
So obviously we need data centers. We need data processing. I'm sure many of your audience, I use multiple AI tools. I have Grammarly, I have ChatGPT, I have Pro Writing Aid, so I have a lot of these technologies that are data processing tools. I like them. I benefit from them. The challenge that I'm hearing from people in different regions of our country, as well as others, is they're not sure what the benefit of the data center is for them. And we call it in my backyard. So everybody wants a power plant, but not in my backyard. Everybody wants, power lines, but not in my backyard. Well, initially, everybody thought data centers were okay, but what they're realizing now is maybe data centers are okay, but not in my backyard. There's concerns that could they require water usage? Now, some systems are cooled, so they may not require water, but then they do require a lot of power and energy, which could drive energy prices up for individuals. And we're already seeing some spikes in energy costs. They also are not necessarily creating a lot of jobs. They create the jobs to build the data center, but it's very few people who have to manage the data center. So as communities are looking at this, they're now saying, what is the benefit for our community? So holistically, yes, we need data centers. But at the local level, people are saying, sure, we need data centers, but not in my backyard. So, what is a solution? Where could those data centers be? Um, I think this is a great example of how space could be a solution for this. It also provides a layer of security. If you have a data center on Earth, that data center could be attacked, could be damaged, could be interrupted, could be jammed, could be spoofed. You put that data center in space. Now, it still could be jammed and spoofed by other technology, but you're now creating an environmental barrier from somebody attacking that center necessarily here on Earth. Now, there are other technologies that could damage that data center on Earth, but we'll save that for another show. But
Another day, yeah.
initially, another day. There are obviously malicious actors
Yeah.
in the space. No matter where you go, what you do, there are always people who want to take advantage of things. Every day I get a note from somebody telling me how they're a prince and they'd like me to help them get their money. So there's always going to be malicious actors that are doing activities, whether it's on Earth or in space. And so we just need to be aware of that as we build data centers in space. What are those protections?
That's a brilliant introduction for my last question, even though I would love to continue, and I think we have to. And that's if there's one subject you want to start a new business, and you think that business is in space, what would that be? Your dream you want to create?
Excellent. Well, I think there's a lot of businesses in space, so it's really hard to pick one. But I think the one that we started with earlier is the one that has the most benefits for humanity, and that's looking at space and healthcare. One of
Mm.
the leaders I love is Dr. Nicole Wagner. She started a company called Lambda Vision. She did it while she was a PhD student and then started the company. And what Lambda Vision is looking to do is 3D print protein lens replacements for your eye to uh, replace sight that's been lost through macular degeneration. So I talked about it earlier. When people age, some people lose their sight. There's no replacement. I know people who have macular degeneration. There's no
Yes,
cure.
awful.
So
Yeah.
she's one of many. And the best way to do that 3D lens replacement of protein is she's doing it on the International Space Station, because 3D printing uh, organ tissue on Earth is challenging because of gravity. It can have a lot of flaws. It can have air bubbles. It can collapse. There's a lot of waste, and that's reduces your ROI. So it's really a business case to say, I want to do this space activity in space because it's a better, higher quality product. So it adds a level of challenge to create the logistics of getting your payload, your material up to the International Space Station or a future commercial lab, have your material 3D printed and returned to you so that it can then be used. But these are the things. I think the first big healthcare breakthrough that alleviates one of these major diseases, Parkinson's, if we or heart disease or some of these other things, I think you're going to see exponentially. Yes, it'll create a wave of return for those investors and entrepreneurs, but also it's going to benefit the quality of life of everyday people here on Earth.
Thanks a lot. That was a wonderful answer to my question. Also, how it connects to how we can improve people's life here on Earth. Thank you, Shelli, for this conversation. I love to pick it up in a couple of months, if I may. I think there's so much more we haven't talked about, and where we still have a lot to learn from you. Thank you. Thank you for being with me.
Thank you so much. I've loved being with you. I definitely look forward to the next time. And until that next time, I'm Shelli Brunswick, and I look forward to seeing you around the galaxy.